October the 31st, 1955. A young woman sits alone and picks up a pen. She is 25 years old. She is a princess. And she is about to sign away the only future that ever made her feel alive. 91 words. That is all it took to end it. 91 words that were negotiated, pressured, and shaped by some of the most powerful people in Britain. Her sister, her Prime Minister, her Archbishop, and her cabinet. And for 70 years, we have been told a comfortable lie about why it happened. We have been told it was the law. We have been told her hands were tied by an obscure Act of Parliament from 1772. But that is not what happened. What actually happened is far more deliberate, far more cold, and far more personal than any law. And that is exactly what we are going to expose today. If you are new here, this channel does not do fairy tales. Hit like, hit subscribe, and stay with me. Because what I am about to walk you through will completely change how you see the British royal family. Now, let us start at the very beginning. Because to understand why that statement destroyed Margaret, you first have to understand who Peter Townsend actually was. And the establishment has spent decades quietly minimizing him into a footnote. Group Captain Peter Townsend was not some inappropriate dalliance. He was not a scandal waiting to happen. He was, by every measurable standard of his era, a hero. He flew Hurricanes for the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940. That means he was one of the men in the sky above southern England when the Luftwaffe were coming in waves, trying to break this country's will to fight. He was decorated. He was distinguished. He was regarded, inside the RAF, as one of the bravest officers of his generation. And in 1944, King George VI, Margaret's own father, personally appointed him as equerry to the royal household. That is not a position you hand to someone unsuitable. That is a position of deep personal trust. Townsend was tall, quiet, and courteous. He had a stillness about him that people who knew him always remarked upon. And inside the palace walls, in the peculiar pressure cooker intimacy of royal household life, a teenage Princess Margaret, bright, restless, funny, and starved of attention that wasn't ceremonial, fell quietly and completely in love with him. Now, the establishment's version of events always fast-forwards past this part. Past the years of genuine closeness, past the depth of what was actually between them, and goes straight to the convenient scandal. But the timeline matters enormously, because by the time their relationship became known to the wider family, Townsend had already divorced his first wife. She had had an affair. He was, in the language of the time, the innocent party in those legal proceedings. He had 2 young sons. He was 16 years older than Margaret, but he was free. And Margaret was 22, and they went to the Queen together and told her they wished to marry. Think about that moment. They did not sneak around. They did not try to force the issue publicly. They went, properly and respectfully, to Elizabeth, Margaret's sister, the new Queen, and they asked. And what happened next is where the real story begins. Now we need to talk about the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, because this is the piece of legislation that has been used as a convenient shield for what was actually a series of human choices. George III pushed this act through Parliament after his brothers went and married women the family considered unsuitable. What it said, essentially, was this. Any descendant of George II needed the sovereign's personal consent to marry before the age of 25. After 25, they could proceed without consent, but Parliament retained the right to object within 12 months, if they were so inclined. Margaret was 22 in 1953 when the relationship became publicly known. Her 25th birthday would fall in August of 1955, so the legal reality was this. She had to wait approximately 2 years, and then, technically, she could marry without her sister's blessing. That was the law. That was the actual shape of it. Not a permanent prohibition, a delay. But here is where the establishment narrative breaks down completely. Because the 2-year wait was not spent leaving them in peace. It was spent applying pressure from every conceivable direction. Townsend was quietly removed from the picture, appointed air attaché to Brussels, posted abroad, kept away. Not because any law required it, because powerful people wanted the fire to die out. They wanted Margaret to get bored, get lonely, get sensible. They wanted the inconvenience to resolve itself. And when it did not, when August 1955 arrived, when Margaret turned 25, when Townsend returned to London and the press camped outside Clarence House, and the whole country held its breath, the establishment moved to the real mechanism. And the real mechanism was not a 1772 Act of Parliament. It was the Church of England. This is the part that almost never gets the attention it deserves, and I want you to stay with me here, because this is the actual engine of what destroyed them. Queen Elizabeth II is not merely the head of state. She is, constitutionally and symbolically, the supreme governor of the Church of England. That title is not ceremonial. It carries real weight. It means that the Church's teachings are, in a meaningful sense, her teachings. They are bound together. And the Church of England's position in 1955, clearly, officially, and without ambiguity, was that divorced people could not remarry in church while their former spouse was still living. Peter Townsend was divorced. His former wife was alive and well. So the question being posed to the Queen was not simply whether her younger sister should be allowed to marry someone she loved. The question being posed was whether the supreme governor of the Church of England should personally sanction a marriage that the church she governed considered sinful and invalid. That was the trap. And the people around the Queen, her advisors, her cabinet, her Archbishop, made certain she understood exactly the shape of that trap before she was asked to choose. And now we come to October 1955. And this is where I want you to feel the full weight of what was happening, because the chronology of these final weeks is extraordinary. Margaret has turned 25. She is, legally, now free to pursue marriage without the Queen's consent. Polling data cited in Christopher Warwick's authorised biography of Margaret showed that only 17% of the British public opposed the marriage. 17%. The country, broadly, wanted her to be happy. The public were on her side, but the establishment was not the public. And Anthony Eden, the Prime Minister, sat down with the Queen and delivered the Cabinet's position with surgical clarity. If Princess Margaret married Peter Townsend, she would be required to formally renounce her place in the line of succession. She would forfeit her income from the civil list, the royal public funding, and she would, in all likelihood, be expected to leave Britain entirely and live abroad as a private citizen, a divorced man's wife, exiled from the family and the institution she had grown up inside. Now pause there for a moment, because Anthony Eden, the man delivering this ultimatum, was himself divorced and remarried. His second wife, Clarissa, was still very much alive and at his side. The rules he was describing to Margaret were rules that had never been applied to him. He had navigated divorce and remarriage without losing his career, his standing, or his country. And yet here he was, explaining to a 25-year-old woman that her love affair would cost her everything she had ever known. And then Geoffrey Fisher, the Archbishop of Canterbury, arrived at Clarence House. He came with books, he came with arguments. He came prepared to make the theological case. And Margaret, and I want you to remember this detail because it tells you exactly what kind of woman she was. Margaret looked at him and said, "Put your books away, Archbishop. I have made up my mind." He assumed she meant she was going ahead with it. She had already decided the opposite. But she was not going to sit there and be lectured at by a man with prepared notes. She had made her own decision, in her own mind, in her own time, and no archbishop was going to get the credit for it. That is not the behaviour of someone who had been broken. That is the behaviour of someone who knew exactly what was being taken from her and refused to pretend it was anything else. But what finally closed the trap, and this is the part that biographers like Anne de Courcy have documented with real precision, was not the Prime Minister, and it was not the Archbishop. It was the silence of her sister. Margaret believed, and the evidence strongly supports that she was right to believe this, that Elizabeth had not fought for her. The Queen was constrained. She was new to the throne, barely 3 years into her reign. She was bound by cabinet advice in a way that was constitutionally real, not manufactured. She could not simply wave away the Church's position. She could not publicly override her own prime minister. The constraints on her were genuine. But constraints are not the same as effort. And Margaret, watching from Clarence House as October wore on and no help came, read her sister's silence as a verdict, as a choice, as an answer to the question, which matters more to you, the institution or me? The institution won, and Margaret signed the statement. Read those 91 words carefully, because every single syllable was deliberate. She said she had decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. Not that she was forbidden, not that she was prevented. She said she had decided. She took ownership of the sacrifice, because that was the one thing left that nobody could take from her: the framing. She then acknowledged that a civil marriage might technically have been possible had she renounced her succession rights. She was telling the country, "I know what was on offer. I chose not to take it." And then she wrapped it in the language of duty and the Church's teachings. And she signed it. And she walked away from the only man she had ever genuinely wanted. Peter Townsend was with her when she wrote it. He helped her shape the words. And then they parted. And they never spoke of it again in public. Now I want to take you forward, because history has a habit of delivering its ironies late. And this particular irony is so stark that it should make every single person who defended that 1955 decision feel deeply uncomfortable. Margaret married Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960, a society photographer, charming and talented, who became Lord Snowdon. The wedding was beautiful, the public loved it, and behind closed doors, almost from the beginning, it was a disaster. The marriage was characterized by mutual infidelity, by cruelty in both directions, by a spectacular unhappiness that biographers have documented in exhaustive and often painful detail. Anne de Courcy's biography of Snowdon paints a portrait of two people who brought out the worst in each other. By the mid-1970s, they were living almost entirely separate lives. In 1978, they divorced. Princess Margaret became the first senior member of the British royal family to divorce since the reign of Henry VIII. The woman who had been denied the right to marry a divorced man because the Church of England couldn't countenance it. That woman ended her own marriage in the divorce court. The symmetry is almost unbearable when you sit with it. She had an affair with Roddy Llewellyn, a man 17 years her junior, which played out publicly and messily and did her reputation no particular favours. She drank heavily through the later decades of her life. She smoked heavily. She had always smoked, but it accelerated. She suffered a series of strokes and health crises in her final years. And the people who knew her best, who wrote about her with the most care and the least sentimentality, almost all arrived at the same conclusion. She never recovered from 1955. Not really. Not fully. The light went out of her in that October. And though she could still be brilliantly funny and searingly sharp, something essential had been switched off permanently. Peter Townsend remarried in 1959. He married a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Germain. And Townsend himself, according to accounts that have circulated among royal biographers, reportedly acknowledged that she bore a strong physical resemblance to Margaret. Draw from that what you will. He died in 1995. Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002, 6 weeks after the death of her mother. She was 71 years old. She had spent 47 years living with the consequences of 91 words. And now, here is the moment I need you to truly absorb, because this is the closing argument, and it is devastating. In April 2005, 50 years after Margaret was told that what she wanted was constitutionally impossible, religiously impermissible, and institutionally unthinkable, Prince Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla, who had been married before. Camilla, whose former husband was still alive. The marriage was conducted as a civil ceremony, with the blessing of the Queen, with the Archbishop of Canterbury himself conducting a blessing service at Windsor Castle the following day. The Church of England, which in 1955 had been immovable, had quietly moved. The rules that had been presented to Margaret as eternal and absolute had, within 50 years, dissolved entirely. Not through any dramatic legislative change, not through any great public reckoning, just quietly, gently, in the way that institutions shift when it becomes convenient for them to shift. Charles married his divorced partner in a civil ceremony. The Queen attended. The Archbishop blessed it. And 3 years before that blessing, Margaret was already in her grave. She was not stopped by a law. Let me be absolutely clear about that. She was stopped by a set of choices made by real, named, identifiable people who had the power to choose differently and did not. She was stopped by a cabinet that imposed conditions no prime minister was legally required to impose. She was stopped by an archbishop who came to her door with prepared arguments. She was stopped by an institution that calculated that her happiness was an acceptable loss. And she was stopped, most painfully, most lastingly, by a sister who did not fight. Now, I am not saying the Queen was a monster. I am not saying Elizabeth made this decision lightly or happily. The constraints on her were real, and I have no interest in simplifying them. But constraints and choices are different things, and Margaret spent her entire remaining life knowing the difference. The Queen had a choice. She made it. And Margaret lived inside that choice for 47 years. What this story actually is, stripped of the romance, stripped of the vintage photographs, stripped of the Netflix dramatization, is a story about what institutions do to the people inside them when those people become inconvenient. Margaret was royal enough to be bound by every rule, every expectation, every obligation of the family she was born into. But she was not royal enough, not the Queen, not the one who mattered, to be protected when protection required the institution to cost itself something. She was expendable. She was the sister they sacrificed. And they dressed it up in the language of duty and faith and constitutional propriety, and they handed her a pen, and she signed. And the cruelest detail of all, the one that I cannot get out of my head, the one that I think deserves to be said plainly and without euphemism, is that the door they slammed in her face in 1955 was quietly opened 50 years later for someone else. Without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without a single person in power standing up and saying, "We were wrong. We were wrong about Margaret. We made a choice, and we called it necessity, and it destroyed her, and we were wrong." She deserved better than 91 words. She deserved better than a sister's silence. She deserved better than a history that keeps blaming a 1772 law instead of the people who were actually in the room. She wasn't stopped by history. She was stopped by people. And it is well past time we said their names. And that is precisely why this story does not belong in the past tense. Because the machinery that crushed Princess Margaret in 1955 did not disappear. It did not reform itself. It did not issue an apology or hold an inquiry, or acknowledge that a young woman had been fed into it and come out the other side broken. It simply waited. It waited until the inconvenience passed, until Margaret was gone, until enough time had elapsed that the whole episode could be repackaged as a tragic romance, rather than what it actually was, an institutional execution dressed up in the language of duty. And the modern royal family has never once, in any public forum, reckoned with what was done to her. Not a word. Not an acknowledgement. When Charles and Camilla married in 2005, nobody in the palace issued a statement saying what that marriage implicitly confirmed. That everything Margaret was told in 1955 was a choice, not a law. That the religious objection was a position, not a commandment. That the constitutional crisis everyone feared never actually had to happen because the rules were always more flexible than the people enforcing them were willing to admit when Margaret was the one asking. Instead, Charles and Camilla got the blessing. They got the Archbishop. They got the Queen smiling in the front row. They got the fairy tale ending that Margaret was explicitly told was impossible. And the institution moved on, without ever once looking back at the woman it had discarded to protect itself. Now I want to say something directly to you, because this is the part of the story that I think matters beyond the history. We talk about the royal family as though it is a fixed and ancient thing, as though its rules and its values and its judgments are handed down from somewhere beyond human reach. But what the Margaret and Townsend story proves, with receipts, with documented sources, with a timeline that is simply not disputable, is that the royal institution makes choices, human choices, made by human beings with human motives. And when those choices hurt people, the institution does not absorb the blame, it distributes it. It spreads it across laws and traditions and the will of God until the original decision, made by specific people in a specific room on a specific afternoon, becomes invisible. Margaret's statement is still available in the Times archive. Go and read it. Read the careful, negotiated language of a woman who was handed a script for her own surrender and asked to make it sound like freedom. Read the part where she says she has resolved to put these considerations before others. Others. She could not even name what she was giving up in her own statement. The word love does not appear once. The word happiness does not appear once. Because those were not the institution's concern. Those were Margaret's problems. And Margaret, as always, was expected to manage her problems quietly and with dignity, and in a way that caused no embarrassment to the family. She did. She managed it with more dignity than any of them deserved. And then she spent 47 years paying the price for their convenience. So the next time someone tells you that the royals are above politics, above self-interest, above the messy calculations of power, remember October the 31st, 1955. Remember a 25-year-old woman with a pen in her hand and 91 words in front of her. Remember that her sister was the Queen, and her Prime Minister was divorced, and her Archbishop came with prepared notes. And none of them, not one, paid a single personal cost for what they asked her to do. She paid for it. All of it. For the rest of her life. That is the truth about Princess Margaret. Not the glamour, not the cigarettes, not the tabloid affairs. The truth is that the British establishment looked at a woman in love and decided, coldly and collectively, that she was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be protected. And they managed her. And we are still calling it her choice. If this video made you see something you had not seen before, if it changed how you think about who these people actually are behind the carefully managed public image, then share it. Because the whole point of this channel is to cut through the mythology and show you the mechanism underneath. That is what Jenny Exposes does, every single week. Like this video if you think Margaret deserved better. Subscribe if you want the truth about the royal family told without fear and without favour. And leave me a comment below, because I want to know what you think. Did the Queen have a real choice? Could she have fought harder for her sister? Or was Margaret always going to be the one who paid? I will be reading every single comment. And next time, we go even deeper. The story I'm covering next makes this one look like a warm-up. Stay close. You do not want to miss it.